going to talk about 5 or so thinkers that I write about in the book, and I'll talk for somewhere between 20 25 minutes or something like that, maybe a little longer, and then see what kinds of questions you have about education today or the argument I'm making in this book. I think the tradition of liberal education in the United States is a great resource for the culture and economy of the country, and I argue that that's a resource that began to be cultivated really in the founding generation of the United States, so with Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin. On the other hand, I also argue that there's nothing incompatible between liberal education and, let's say, massive open online classes. So on the one hand, the argument is comfort to the traditionalists in higher education who really want to emphasize what they see as core disciplines that might be forgotten in the rush to practicality or vocational education. On the other hand, I actually don't argue about liberal arts education, which really is about a set of disciplines. My approach is from American pragmatism, which helps us see that anything can be taught in the framework of liberal education. That is, you can have a skill-based approach to teaching, but as long as that approach includes conceptual and contextual dimensions that looks at the integrative dimensions of whatever you're learning, its connections with other things, then that would qualify in this American tradition as liberal education, which is different from the European notion of liberal arts, which really said there were certain things you just had to know if you were well educated. You had to read Shakespeare, or you had to learn Greek, or you had to learn history and literature. I actually don't think that that is what liberal education has been about in the United States, which has been about useful knowledge, but useful knowledge put in a broad contextual framework. And so I'll talk about it in terms of 4 moments in this tradition. The first one goes under the rubric of liberate, and I'll talk about Jefferson in that regard, and a word about a commentator on the Jeffersonian tradition, a man named David Walker, a free black living in Massachusetts, who wrote an incendiary document against slavery. I'll talk about, the second beat will be animate, and I'll talk about Emerson. The third will be cooperate, and I'll talk there very quickly about Dewey and Jane Addams. And the fourth will be instigate. I was pretty proud when I came up with these 4 things that rhyme. Because I'm a historian. I don't usually get to rhyme things. But the dumb part of this was that I came up with this while I was sitting waiting to give my lecture at the University of Peking about 1.5 years ago. I was trying to organize my thoughts, and I said, I have 4 things, and I'll be liberate, animate, cooperate, instigate. And I went up there to deliver it, and I realized that it was in simultaneous translation. And that my translator, although she was very gifted, was not going to make any attempt to find rhyming words in Chinese. So you get the benefit of the Chinese version of my book in this framework. It is interesting to me. We could talk about it in the discussion session. It is interesting to me how liberal education, although it's under enormous pressure in the United States, is attracting adherents like never before in China, in Korea, in India, where there is a great dissatisfaction with rote education and exam-based education, and a growing interest in what we might call liberal education. So let me say a word about liberate and Thomas Jefferson. So Jefferson writes to his friend or frenemy, John Addams, he says, ours will be the follies of enthusiasm. Ours will be the follies of enthusiasm, not of bigotry. So Jefferson realized that if you had an open-ended educational framework, if you let students do what they want, you're going to get follies. You're going to get overly enthusiastic students. You know, I'm a president of university. I have to deal with things like fraternities and big parties and things like that. And so I was both intrigued and depressed by seeing that Thomas Jefferson, when he started the University of Virginia, was doing the same thing that I have to do on Monday mornings. He was dealing with things like the students were overly inebriated over the weekend, and they were throwing rocks at a professor's house. And so he said, what do I do? Do I call the police in town, or do I settle this on the university's disciplinary sessions itself? The same kind of questions, alas, that many university administrators deal with today. I'm sure you don't have these problems at Google, even in the well-stocked cafeteria. But for Jefferson, liberate meant that you got education so that you were capable of autonomous thinking. Education, he was an Enlightenment guy. Education meant that you were able to stand on your own 2 feet, make autonomous decisions, and you were learning things that not only made you autonomous, but gave you the capacity to act in the world. He was interested in history and in literature, to be sure, but for Jefferson, the model was the sciences, that inquiry should drive education, but inquiry without stifling questions through predetermined organizational frameworks. That's a clumsy way of saying something rather simple. He didn't want his educational system to look like Harvard. That was like, and that's a red thread through American education. How can both the emulation of Harvard and the resentment of it. Jefferson said, what happens when you go to Harvard is your parents tell you. Anybody go to Harvard in this room? Oh, what do you have? Very nice. So thank you for admitting that. Jefferson said what happens in his day, of course, the early 1800s, what happens when you go to Harvard is your parents picked out what you were going to major in. Your parents picked out your slot. And so you went to school in order to assume your fate. And that was the opposite for Jefferson of what education should be. Education should be the time when you discover who you might become, rather than having to take on the burden that your parents had ascribed to you. So at the University of Virginia, he said, when you start, you shouldn't choose your major. You should start with questions, with inquiry, and over time, because you've been liberated by knowledge, by learning, over time, you choose the thing you want to learn more about. You choose the thing you want to specialize in. Education will set you free. And for Jefferson, it was so important because he thought that the young republic needed an educational system that would tap into the natural talents of an increasing and diverse population. So he worried that what would happen in education, as it had happened in Europe, is that the rich and powerful would have a monopoly on good education. They would make sure that only rich and powerful people could go to really good schools. And so Jefferson said, in a not politically correct phrase, he said, we have to rake the rubbish to find really talented people. And then the state should pay for them to go to school. Financial aid was absolutely crucial, because otherwise rich people would make sure that only rich people would go to really good schools. It sounds a little bit familiar in some ways. I mean, Williams, no, I'm sorry. So this, I have to make one Williams joke. It's a Wesleyan tradition. But that without financial aid, what would happen through educational systems is you would reproduce social hierarchy. And Jefferson was interested in the ways that educational institutions could challenge social hierarchy, allowing people of talent but without resources to get ahead. Pretty straightforward. Now, of course, you all know that Thomas Jefferson was not the most, well, he was egalitarian in some respects, but also viciously prejudiced against Africans, against Indians in different ways, against women in different ways. And so, although I want to emphasize that Jefferson's Enlightenment view of education as liberation is fundamental in the United States, it also had many blind spots. But what was interesting for me in researching this book, because my own work was in European history before I wrote this book Beyond the University, is that many people took up the Jeffersonian tradition in their own efforts to achieve liberation. David Walker, who writes just before the Civil War, he writes a pamphlet denouncing Jefferson. but he denounces Jefferson in Jeffersonian terms. In other words, he says, Jefferson was right about education. He was right about liberation. But we blacks should take that message of liberation and overthrow the system of slavery. David Walker writes, I don't want any white people helping us get free from slavery. I want education to get us free from slavery. David Walker, when he published this, became a marked man. A price was put on his head. People wanted to bring him back to the South so he could be tortured before he was killed. But if you killed him right away, you'd be able to collect the reward. He didn't. He died of tuberculosis, we think. But that pamphlet, which he sewed into the clothes of sailors who were going through the South and other itinerant workers, that pamphlet was a call to education as a vehicle for liberation. Frederick Douglass, writing just around the time of the Second World War, he relates the story of when he was a slave, a young slave, a kid, working with a pretty genteel mistress. She was teaching him how to read. She was teaching him how to read the Bible. She said, look at this little Freddie. He can read the Bible. Showed her husband. He went crazy. He said, you can't let this kid read. He'll never be fit for slavery. And Douglass said, ding, 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 right? That's the Jeffersonian thing. If you learn, you are not going to be a slave. You'll be liberated. You'll be free. And so Douglass says, look at all these laws in the South that say don't teach black people to read. There are no laws saying don't teach cows to read or don't teach dogs to read. It's because they know we can read. They know we're human beings. They know we should be liberated. They just pass laws to oppress us, Frederick Douglass writes in the 1840s. So liberation is part of this American tradition or devotion to education. Animate, the second of my four moments, I'll be quicker about, but it just gives me a chance to say a word about one of my heroes in writing this book is Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's just an extraordinary writer, a really important philosopher. Americans don't always think of him as a philosopher. He really inspired Nietzsche's best work and is a glorious figure in American intellectual history. Emerson, he goes to visit colleges, and I'm afraid it's Harvard again. He goes to visit Harvard, and he's telling people, you should get out of here. What you're learning here in college is how to conform to society. You're not learning to think aversively, as he put it. You're not learning to think against the grain. You're not learning to be what you might call today a contrarian. What you're learning is how to fit in. And Emerson said, no, stop learning. That's not learning, that's corruption. What should happen in college, he says, is not that you learn by drilling and learn to take tests. Emerson says, what should happen in college is that we should set your souls aflame. Set your souls aflame. And what he talks about so beautifully in The American Scholar and in Self-Reliance and other places, these short essays that are just glorious works of American literature, he says what we should learn, what learning should be, is the process through which we increase our ability to make the world alive for ourselves. You know what happens. You walk out of Google, down 9th Avenue, you go by lots of things that don't make any impression on you. They are kind of dead to you, right? But then suddenly something will make an impression. It's alive for you. And Emerson said what education should do is make more of the world alive for you as you move through it. So, if you walk around, like everybody blames Google for this, I don't know if it's true. If you walk around like this, the only things that are going to be alive for you are going to be framed by this little device. Now I guess they're bigger. But for Emerson, what should happen is you should toss this aside and see what's vital out there in nature, in art, in music. And you've all had this experience, right? Sometime in your past, maybe in college, when music you would have not even known was music suddenly becomes alive for you. People who you would have ignored suddenly become interesting to you. The world becomes a bigger place. And Emerson thought that was part of liberal education. Not just liberate, animate, make the world more alive. The third moment in my four is cooperate. Because the first two guys, Emerson and Jefferson, the first two, they're very individualistic. They're guys. They're really focused on the individual self becoming autonomous and liberated, or becoming capable of making the world alive. Towards the end of the 1800s, through American pragmatism, there develops another way of thinking that emphasizes cooperation as part of what education should be about. And the figure there that I write about in the book, I write about a few people. William James is very important to me, and I'll say a word about Dewey. But Jane Addams is really key here. Jane Addams is most famous in American history for founding Hull House and being the kind of one of the founders of modern social work in a way, working with immigrants and poor people in Chicago. But her intersection with this tradition of education is worth spending a couple of minutes on. Jane Addams was born kind of well-to-do Midwesterner, wanted to go to college, wanted to get a real education. There weren't that many options for women at that time. She wanted to go to Smith. Her dad said, "No, too far. You're too fragile. Go to a convent school." So she goes to a convent school. She's not religious. She's not really anti-religious, but she doesn't really feel a vocation. So she goes to the school. She does very well, and she finishes up like she's really, really smart. But her father says, "Nah, I don't think you're a girl. You don't have to go to a university or college." But just around that time, he dies. And so there she has this, and she inherits this money. She could do what she wants, one would think. But since I spent most of my life working on Freud, I realized that the most powerful parent is often the dead parent, right? The parent whose wishes you follow even though they're not there. This is a basic psychoanalytic tradition or myth or law, depending on your view of such things. And so Jane Addams, when her father dies, respects his wishes and says, "I'm not going to go to college, but I'm going to learn in other ways." And so she has money, she travels, she really does educate herself. She has an entourage of other women who are interested in learning. And at some point, she realizes something what she calls the snare of preparation. And you may see this among your friends, or maybe here at Google, you may see some of this. People who learn so many things that they become less and less capable of doing very much. They kind of get overwhelmed by what they know. Yeah, you're laughing. I guess that you know people like this, right? In universities, I've seen it once or twice. And so Jane Addams gives this great example. I want to share it with you. She says she's walking down the street, I think in London. She's walking down the street, and she sees a guy hit by a carriage, a horse-drawn carriage. He knocks him over. He falls into the street, and he's in distress. She immediately thinks of a poem by De Quincey, who was thinking about something in Homer that was about the inability of a person to act in relation to someone who needs help. You see the circuit, right? Instead of just saying, "Get an ambulance," or "Call the cops," or "What can I do to help you?" she thinks of a poem about the inability to call for help. She calls this the snare of preparation. And it's a lovely phrase. She says, "I've lumbered my mind with literature. It's so cluttered. And what I want to do," she says, "is take what I've learned and put it to work in the world." Preparation can be a snare if you are never really going to act on it, right? I guess it's like being intellectually muscle-bound. If you go to the gym, right, you see sometimes people who are just, they're so muscle-bound, all you can do is look at their muscles. They're not really good for anything, right? And that happens intellectually too. People get intellectually muscle-bound. And she says that one of the attributes of this inability to act is also an inability to see things from the perspective of another person. Jane Addams was very interested in how you can have very smart people gathered around a table, gathered around an issue, and they seem incapable of compromise because of their unwillingness to sympathetically enter into the way of thinking of another person. she calls this, the talent for overcoming this, the sympathetic interpretation. So you probably know people who are very good at this. Like if you go to a meeting and people are really arguing about something, like what's a tactic they're going to use, sometimes there's a person in the room who's able to say, if we do some of this and some of that, you have a point in this way, you have a point in that way, and they're not merely fudging it. They're actually advancing the conversation into action that will be productive. What Jane Addams worries about in universities is that sometimes we show how smart we are by showing how intransigent we can be, how we get stuck in our own perspective. And that instead she looks for a kind of intelligence that would be exemplified in our ability to see things from someone else's perspective. Cooperation as an important vehicle of real education. William James, who was a fan of Addams's, and they were in a mutual admiration society, I guess. William James talks about this as overcoming a certain blindness. He wrote an essay based on a lecture he gave to teachers called "Overcoming a Certain Blindness in Human Beings," where he tells a story. He's being shown some settlements in North Carolina out in the woods, and he's looking at these settlements where the people just kind of chopped down the forest and they're burning, making clearings. And his driver is going along, and James is like, "Oh God, this is horrible. It's what happened to the beautiful nature in the woods." And then the driver turns to him and says, "Isn't this great? Can you see what we've accomplished? We've created homes, we've created farms." And James suddenly realizes that he's been blind to what this driver sees. And just like he says, if the driver came to Cambridge and saw William James sitting in his room reading his book, studying, he would say, "God, that poor guy, he must be being punished." He'd be blind to James's reality. So James says, as teachers, how do we enter into someone else's reality? How do we overcome blindness so that we can engage in cooperation? So we've gone from autonomy and liberation in Jefferson to animation, making the world more of a alive place in Emerson, in cooperation in Jane Addams and James, and now for the last word, instigate, I want to use as a bridge John Dewey, and I end with Richard Rorty, who some of you may have known. He was a philosopher at Princeton and Stanford and UVA, a teacher of mine when I was at Princeton. But Dewey said, Dewey read Jane Addams with great admiration and affection, and Dewey thought we should be emphasizing not just autonomy, we should be emphasizing interdependence. And Dewey would not be surprised by network theory today. And for Dewey, the search for autonomy was a kind of American pathology. What we should be searching for and exploiting is greater interdependence, because that's where great things happen. And Dewey emphasized that education should always be dealing with the problems of human beings. It should never retreat from the social, political, and scientific spheres into esotericism, because that was a failure of connecting ideas to action. And for Dewey, as a pragmatist, the only reason to learn new ideas was to create new habits of action. That is a fundamental pragmatist principle, that what we learn when we learn new ideas are habits of action, and that habits of action are what make us more liberated, more able to animate. It's all about activity in the world and not just about accumulating facts. Dewey here was in some ways echoing Ben Franklin, who bemoaned the state of education in the late 18th century. Franklin said, all you learn at these fancy schools is how to exit a drawing room properly. You learn how to put on your tie, right? That's all you learn at these fancy schools, Franklin said. But Franklin said, not like our Silicon Valley friends today. Franklin didn't say, like those guys say today, don't go to school, just learn how to code. Don't go to school, just learn how to make an app. Don't go to school, just learn how to do a startup. he didn't say that. Franklin said, don't go to a school where all you learn is how to drop names and recite facts. Let's start a reading school. Let's start a science club. Let's start a educational project that will broaden us and not narrow us. Broadening rather than narrowing is the key to this tradition, and Dewey picks up on that. Broadening, so a problem in philosophy is a problem for human beings and not just for philosophers. A problem in history is a human problem that is informed through historical study, not just some facts you learn so you can recite to impress your friends or your teachers. And so that move towards human problems, towards social issues, ends me up with this term instigate that Richard Rorty used to talk about higher education. He said what higher education should be mostly about is giving us a capacity to challenge the prevailing consensus, to instigate change. Rorty was rigorously anti-consensus. I remember when E.O. Wilson published this very popular book called Consilience, which is about how all science and humanities can come together into a happy harmony. Rorty said, harmony, bah, humbug. You don't get progress through harmony. You get progress by challenging consensus and then necessitating new modes of cooperation to build a new consensus that someone else will challenge. You don't want consensus. You want challenge, inquiry. You want to instigate change. Science and the humanities are about challenging the prevailing wisdom through inquiry, instigating change. And so this liberal tradition of education in the United States is pragmatic because it is not about acquiring a set of facts. It is not about assuming a role that your parents or someone else has set up for you. It is not about supporting the status quo. Liberal education in the United States has been about increasing our ability to stand on our feet, work with other people, animate the world, challenge the prevailing consensus, because that is how innovation and positive change can take place. Today, that tradition is under great pressure. I don't mean, as I'm sure you know, I published a little piece earlier this fall in the Daily Beast called How to Destroy American Higher Education, which is about the retreat from this tradition towards only technical fields, and especially for only some people who only need to know one thing. I think that is going to result in the impoverishment of American thinking and our diminishing our capacity for innovation. It is true that liberal education shouldn't be about the same things that would have been taught 100 years ago or 50 years ago, for sure. But it should still be, at least in my hopeful view, it should still be about challenging the prevailing consensus through cooperation, liberation, and making the world more vital, animating it for ourselves and for the people around us. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. If questions, you've been so attentive. Yes?
Could you relate the early views of education by Jefferson, etc.? Correct me if I'm mistaken in my understanding, but a lot of education at that time was geared to preparing you for the bar or the clergy.
Right. That's a great question. So Jefferson was rigorously anti-religion, right? And so when he founded UVA, he wouldn't let any chapels on the campus, and he didn't have a place for the study of religion at all. So for Jefferson, when I say he rejected the model that you know what you're going to study when you get there, it was both to go either be a minister or a judge or a lawyer, and so for him, it was inquiry-based education, which meant you couldn't know what you were going to do yet because you didn't start the inquiry yet, and that meant being open to what he called all forms of useful knowledge, and So he was very interested in astronomy, in agriculture, in investigations of the natural world, and in politics that would result in further inquiry and different kinds of work after you had finished your studies. So that was against the grain, for sure, of higher education as it was practiced in New England. Yes.
So how do you think that universities are doing with regard to these four philosophies? How do you think Wesleyan, the institution that you lead, is doing? Are these philosophies prevailing in how learning offerings are constructed, developed?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that there's, at a place like Wesleyan, these four things are very strong. I think they're unevenly distributed across the campus. So, for example, cooperation, which we all know is such an important part of the work people are going to do after they leave the university, is probably not as prominent at Wesleyan and a lot of schools as it should be. So I teach history and philosophy classes, and I give you an assignment. You write a paper, I get it, I give you brilliant comments, but I give it back to you, and that's that. You know, no one else sees them. And people aren't working enough in teams. People aren't learning the skills of cooperation as much as they can. There's more of that at Wesleyan than there was before, but there could be a lot more. In the sciences, of course, you do have that because people work in labs, and so they do work in teams. We find more and more the desire of students to work in concert with one another. So one of the challenges, I mean, it's kind of a dumb example, but it's an easy one. You know, so I teach a class with 100 some odd students now in film and philosophy. And at times, especially if I'm droning on too long, I'll say, okay, we're going to get into groups. I want you to come up with an answer to the following question. So everybody can talk, and the chairs don't move. You know, they're all geared to everybody sitting there watching the professor, which is, you know, gives me a narcissistic thrill twice a week. But it's not great for education, right? You'd want more of that mixture. And we are creating maker spaces now. There's a strong desire of students at a place like Wesleyan to immediately start thinking what I can build with what I'm learning. That could be an organization, that could be a computer program, that could be an object. And I think that's I find that exciting, given the pragmatist views that I've been describing to you. I think a lot of schools now are trying to figure out how they can maintain this tradition while also answering the anxiety that a lot of students and parents have about what are they going to do when they graduate. You know, in the book I say, in this book Beyond the University, I tell this story that, you know, when I was a kid, the movie The Graduate came out. And anybody seen The Graduate? Some of you seen it? Oh, okay, so some of you have seen it. So you know, in the early part of the movie, Dustin Hoffman is the main character in the film. He's a young guy at the time. He's just graduated from college. He's confronted by, I think it's his uncle, and his uncle comes to say, "I got one word for you, plastics." Right? Plastics. He'd say, So today it would be apps or, I don't know, startups. But when that movie came out, everybody who saw that scene laughed at this idiot who was, you know, a jerk. And he was an old fart jerk. You laughed at him. Today, people would say, "Oh, really? Okay, apps." You know, that's the feeling I get, that today people are so worried about, and there's good reason for worry, about their economic prospects, that they're looking for great shortcuts, which may actually tend to undermine their abilities in the economic sphere. So schools are trying to do a lot more to show how you can translate what you're learning on campus to what you're going to do next. And I think that's a good thing. I think that the good thing is that people shouldn't just go to college as an interruption in their life. Like, I want to have 3 or 4 great years and then I go do other stuff. College, one of my predecessors said, if these are the best 4 years of your lives, we will have failed you. Because I don't want you just to be nostalgic. I want you to say, I'm using my education. And we, as professors at colleges, should actually help students figure out how they're going to translate the theoretical computer science that we teach at Wesleyan into what they might do next. Not just skip the theory, but to always be thinking about, can you translate this into other terms? Yeah.
Follow-up question. Similarly, I went to University of Michigan undergrad, political science minor in Latin American studies. No plan really, honestly, for what I was going to do. I luckily, have ended up at a great company working in marketing, but I have a much younger sister, and she's in middle school now. And when she talks to me about what she might want to do, I have a very hard time reconciling the experience I had and the love I had for learning sort of for the sake of learning with
Yeah.
a recommendation for her, because it seems so impractical to me now. Given
You're an old fogey now,
I
huh?
know. And so, but my question is more like in Europe, you see kids going off to college who seem a bit more prepared with experience or sort of practical internships or things that they've done to explore maybe a bit earlier what they might want to do, it seems, versus in the US, you kind of get there and you have your 2 years to kind of figure it out before you declare your major. And
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, is there a way we could do something better before you actually get to college to help prepare kids to think about what they could do afterwards, even if they study something that's still like a more liberal arts major?
It's a great question. I do think the European model does really decide. It is people have to decide what they're going to do with their lives very early, and some people they're just not going to they're just not going to get the education. So I think about this a lot. And when I was finishing college in 1978, the job market was far worse, I think, than it is today, actually. And my parents didn't go to college. They found this whole thing kind of very befuddling, that I was studying philosophy and history. And I told my dad, who was a furrier, that I wanted to go to graduate school, I thought, but I was worried because I didn't know any professors who weren't my own teachers, So, what are you going to do with it? And my professor said, "There's no way you should go to graduate school thinking you're going to get a job in academia." There were no jobs, and so you can go for your education. If you get a fellowship, you can, it's okay. But don't think you can get a job. So I remember telling my dad this, and he said to me, "Well, you know how to make money. I washed dishes in college. I had an uncle who was a cab driver." He said, "You have got connections," and so. He said, if you don't try, you're always going to wonder, what did you really love to do? And if it doesn't work, you'll figure it out. You'll figure out how to make money. Now, I thought, in retrospect, I'm thinking to myself, my God, what a brave thing to say. It was so liberating as a kid. I asked him about this at the end of his life. He said, "I don't remember telling you that." That's the kind of guy he was. He was like, "I wouldn't say that." He was a tough guy. And I think part of the answer is economics. That America is a much more unequal place today than it was when I was leaving college. And so there is a legitimate fear that if you don't make it, you are really you're really in dire straits, rather than being in this middle range, which is eroded. But I think it's also that my parents expected I might have to struggle. A lot of the parents I talk to, their kids have never had to struggle, and they don't want them to start struggling after college. And they want more certainty. And I don't know, I mean, a lot of you probably majored in computer science or other things that were related to what you're doing now, but a lot of you may not have. And I think the ability to explore new things has enriched what we wind up doing in so dramatic ways in this country for such a long time, that to cut that off and think that we are going to be more successful if we have more specialization, I think is a mistake. I think what we'll have are specialists who become obsolete more quickly, and we will have less of intellectual resources to draw upon for creative change.
So just really quick follow-up to that. So how do you think maybe certain institutional factors need to change to support that? Because student debt, for example, is a very scary thing now. I think like interest rates have gone up. Well, not all interest rates.
Yeah. Student debt is scary, even if without. Yeah. Absolutely.
I wonder what needs to happen so that kids can feel more secure.
Yeah.
Taking those risks.
That's a great question, and that's the onus is on schools like mine, which becomes so darn expensive. So we have a lot more low-income students at Wesleyan than we did 20 years ago or 15 years ago, But we also, and we have a lot of very wealthy people, but the middle ground is eroded because, you know, if you're not poor enough to get a big scholarship, you may also not be rich enough to afford, you know, to go. And so we need at colleges and universities to find ways to contain costs. And you know, we've been doing that at Wesleyan for the last few years, and I think, you know, a lot of schools would be in their interest to do that. But part of the answer is also that the state and governments have massively retreated from supporting education, making it a lot more expensive for a lot more people. And I think that's, you know, that's unconscionable, and that's a political decision to spend money on other things and not on education. And I think some of this call for vocationalism is coming from people who have made it impossible for folks to go to community colleges and to state universities, which have become much more expensive. The growth in fees at state universities far outpaces the privates. And the student debt is also driven, of course, by a lot of for-profit institutions that have no intention of graduating students, but they can just claim tuition. So there are things that government can do, there are things that schools can do. The reason I taught these MOOCs is because I wanted to see if you could do something much more efficiently. It wouldn't be the same as just, you know, meeting with a group like this size and having the conversation. But I've taught, I don't know, 150,000 people in the last 2 years online, as opposed to the, you know, my big, massive class at Wesley is 100 kids. And I think that's a very interesting experience. It's not the answer to all of these things, but experimentation and scale will help us, I think, make the investment in education less risky for students. Yes, 1, 2, okay.
So I'm a huge liberal arts proponent. You know, I went to liberal arts school, and every time I just think it's, especially in the computer age, it is completely an essential part of just becoming a better human being. But I have seen the reality of, I guess it's not to say that, I have seen the reality that because of internet, because of Google, data is available everywhere.
Yeah.
So what that means is that specialization or commitment, shall we say, rather than specialization, commitment becomes really important, even for a very liberal arts person.
Yeah.
So I want to be a better human being who knows a lot of other stuff that can help me make decisions, but I also want to be going into new territories and exploring new things within that field, right?
Yeah.
Because you want to be actually contributing rather than just talking. For
Absolutely,
example. Like
absolutely.
if you want to join the UN, you have to be very specialized. If you want to actually make a difference, you have to know your stuff, which is why, like, you know, as a result of this data, internet, and world coming closer together. So have you seen, like, very specific, you know, initiatives that your university or other college, I guess, leadership teams have done to kind of help the liberal arts tradition, but specifically really work towards people who are, you know, a little bit more better prepared?
Absolutely. I think a lot of schools, and this won't be a surprise to you, have responded to student demand for internships, for example. So they start very early figuring out how they can translate what they're doing on campus to what they're going to do off campus. This is good for businesses that get inexpensive labor in some cases. And I resisted it for a while because I thought they should be paid a decent wage, and some companies do. But I see that students really want, even when they want that broad education, they want the capacity to connect it to other things. That desire to connect, I think, is part of this tradition and can be very important. Specialization within a liberal learning tradition is important. In other words, you don't want just to be a jack of all trades and master of none, right? It takes real skills to do work in any variety of fields today, and that may be language skills, that may be technical skills, that may be experience over long periods of time. And so I think colleges and universities, I think, are aware that while you're giving people breadth, you also have to give them skills so that they can continue to learn. The point of this book, Beyond the University, is that the university should give you the ability to keep learning. And if you, not just a smattering of things, but habits of mind and spirit that keep you learning so that you can go deeper into subject areas and not just scatter across them.
financial pressure on parents of students who are worried of the economic realities the students will face after college.
Yeah.
How do you negotiate that ideal with the financial realities that the university encounters on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I'm going to ask you all for money before you leave. No. It's a great question. I mean, when I'm in New York for fundraising. After I leave today, I'm going to a fundraising campaign meeting for Wesleyan, and most of the money we raise is for financial aid. So I mean, just as kind of straightforward economic decision, we depend for about more than 2/3 of our revenue comes from tuition. We would be able to do a lot more if we depended less on tuition. We would have greater access and more research opportunities. Let's just to take two things. And so one of the things that I think can be very dangerous for American institutions is in the search for good, strong tuition dollars and good, strong donations to just cater to the wealthy. And Wesleyan has this long tradition that even the wealthy people who come to Wesleyan, they don't want to be among only wealthy people. They realize that for them, that's not going to, they didn't want to join a social club. They want to join a diverse community where they'll learn from different kinds of people. And so the pressures at places like Wesleyan is to balance access and the investment in high quality programs, because most of our budget is going to compensation, and teachers are certainly not overpaid at a place like Wesleyan, and they work best when they work in small groups with students. That's expensive. How to combine that with, let's say, the ability to deliver lectures online? I mean, I do think before too long, no one will have lecture classes at an expensive school like Wesleyan. All of that will be done elsewhere. And then when you're there, you really are working in teams, you're working in small groups, you're getting the most out of it. I mean, there are efficiencies we will gain. At Wesleyan, we started, you may remember this, we started showing how you can get a 3-year diploma with the same number of credits, and save 20% off your total tuition. I did that when I was a student to save my grumpy dad some money, and he was unimpressed. But most students don't take advantage of it, even though it really is a great economic. It's not that hard intellectually. You just work in the summer a little bit in the winter, but people really love being there. So, I'm trying to create more avenues for more efficient education that doesn't sacrifice the breadth of the education, but more access points that will be more efficient and cost effective. Was there a hand back here? No? Yes?
I was thinking that I would make probably choose better for my son, that when we decide that, okay, you should probably need to do learning, you probably need to learn more what things to it. But I believe that some rote learning is actually necessary so that you can, for example, if you don't rote learn multiplication tables, then many are surprised when I came to the United States that most people know.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So to build the blocks, you need some kind of basic.
You need scaffolding, right? To build something, you need scaffolding, and memory work is a really important scaffolding for this. So if I sounded like I was saying that no rote learning, I misspoke, because there is a dimension of just exercising these faculties that is key. Just like when you're learning to play the piano, I think Thelonious Monk said there are no wrong notes on the piano, but that may be good when you're Thelonious Monk, but when you want to learn how to do scales, you want to learn to do theory, there are things you just have to learn. Muscle memory, mental muscle memory, that's really important. I don't know how you'll feel about this, but just last night I read this article in the Atlantic Mobile that says, "Is Google making us stupid?" This is not the first time this title has been used, but it's about this. The article is about people who use GPS all the time get lost in their own bathroom, kind of thing, right? And people who just use calculators, they don't even understand what multiplication is, let alone how to do it. And so the ways in which our machines replace the exercise of our faculties, this article is pointing out, is dangerous. So obviously you don't want to throw away the machines, but you want to use them in a way that enhances your capacity rather than replaces your capacity. I mean, that's the sweet spot.
Well,
Thank you all so much for coming. It was great to talk with you.